The sugar plantations of Louisiana in 1854 existed in a state of perpetual violence that made even Carolina's rice fields seem almost pastoral by comparison. This was a landscape where enslaved people were worked literally to death during grinding season and replaced through the constant influx of human bodies sold downriver from the upper South. The Beaumont estate occupied a bend in the Mississippi, where the soil was rich enough to grow cane that produced sugar sweet enough to command premium prices in New Orleans and beyond. It was maintained by labor so brutal that the average life expectancy of a field hand was just 7 years from the moment they arrived. The big house rose white and elegant above quarters that were little more than shacks, its architecture announcing to anyone who looked that some lives were designed for comfort, while others were meant for consumption. Here, human beings could be converted into commodities as efficiently as cane could be converted into sugar, as long as enough violence was applied and called economics. If you're drawn to stories where children born under curses become weapons against the systems that tried to destroy them, where Louisiana voodoo turns slave catchers into cautionary tales whispered to keep children from wandering too close to certain bayous, where the powerless discover that sometimes being born different means being born dangerous, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Because the kind of power that rose from Louisiana mud and African memory doesn't recognize borders or centuries. At the plantation's edge, in a cabin that seemed to tilt as if the ground beneath it was perpetually uncertain, lived a girl the Beaumont family inventory listed as Marie, approximately 12 years, house servant, mother, Celestine, deceased, father unknown, acquired at birth as increase, value assessed at $400. That description captured nothing of who Marie truly was, or what she represented to both the enslaved community and the white people who encountered her, and felt something ancient and unsettling in her gaze. She had been born during a hurricane 13 years earlier, on a night when the Mississippi rose so high it nearly swallowed the quarters. Lightning struck the same cypress tree 3 times in succession. Every animal on the plantation went silent at once, as if nature itself were holding its breath to witness something that shouldn't exist entering the world. Her mother, Celestine, died 3 days after the birth, not from complications of delivery, but from something the plantation doctor couldn't diagnose. A wasting sickness consumed her from the inside, while she whispered in Creole, French, and African languages about debts being paid, bargains being honored, and her daughter carrying something meant to balance accounts, written in blood and suffering. The midwife, a woman named Tante Josephine who practiced Louisiana voodoo and understood what white medicine refused to acknowledge, tried to warn Master Beaumont that the child was Nuzun Maladikong, curseborn, and should be given to the river, or at least sent far away before whatever lived inside her learned to use the girl's hands and voice. Beaumont laughed, dismissed it as superstition, and kept Marie because enslaved children represented an investment that would mature into profit. For the first 8 years of her life, Marie seemed mostly normal, despite small warning signs, plants withering when she passed them in certain moods, animals refusing to approach her even when she tried to feed them, the way shadows around her sometimes bent wrong, as if light itself behaved differently in her presence. She worked in the big house alongside her Aunt Letty, learning to clean, serve, and make herself small and invisible, in the way enslaved children were taught meant survival. But when she turned 9, something changed. Whether it was puberty, the curse awakening fully, or the weight of daily violence finally demanding an outlet, no one could say. But the first slave catcher vanished soon after. His name was Dubois. He specialized in tracking runaways through the bayous and swamps around New Orleans. He bragged that no trail could hide from him and always returned with his quarry in chains, or with proof of death worth half the bounty. After 2 field hands escaped following a beating that blinded one of them, Beaumont hired Dubois. He arrived with his dogs, his confidence, and his reputation. For 3 days he interrogated the enslaved about routes and accomplices. Then he made his mistake. Marie walked past carrying water. Dubois grabbed her and demanded to know if she had seen or heard anything about the runaways. She looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her face, darker than any human eyes should be, and said quietly, in English, layered with rhythms far older than Louisiana itself, "You should go home. The bayou doesn't want you." Dubois laughed and shoved her aside. That night, he entered the swamp with his dogs. None of them ever returned. 3 days later, search parties found his boat circling slowly in a small lagoon, as if the current itself were moving it in deliberate patterns. There was no sign of Dubois or the dogs, only paw prints leading to the water's edge and then stopping, as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. Officials blamed the bayou. Alligators, snakes, sinkholes, accidents. The wetlands were notorious killers. But in the quarters, people whispered that Marie had done something, that Dubois was the first payment, not the last. Tante Josephine began teaching Marie darker work, voodoo not meant for healing or protection, but for commanding spirits through offerings, threats, and ancient leverage. Marie learned with terrifying speed. Some of what Josephine taught wasn't instruction at all, but activation, unlocking knowledge that had always existed inside her. Marie learned which spirits answered which offerings, which songs opened which doors, how to draw vague symbols that bridged worlds. She learned that Baron Samedi and Maman Brigitte both had interest in punishing slave catchers, because slavery had created so many unmarked graves that the spirits of the dead now crowded the crossroads demanding justice. But Marie could do things that went beyond even voodoo's wide boundaries. She could speak to the bayou and be answered. She could look at someone and know exactly how they would die. She could touch objects and see their full history. Even Tante Josephine became afraid. She realized Marie wasn't merely a practitioner of voodoo. She was a vessel, a weapon, a payment for whatever Celestine had bargained for 13 years earlier. The second slave catcher was a woman named Beauchamp. She infiltrated free black communities, identified runaways, and sent dozens back into bondage. She arrived at Beaumont, chasing rumors of a network helping enslaved people escape to Mexico. After weeks of investigation, she cornered Marie in the big house kitchen and demanded information. Marie calmly said, "You'll die screaming in water so dark you won't know which way is up. No one will hear you. Your body will feed things that have been hungry since before your grandmothers were born." Beauchamp reported the threat. Beaumont had Marie whipped, 20 lashes that scarred her back, but did nothing to silence what lived inside her. 3 days later, Beauchamp's body was found in a narrow bayou channel, drowned in water barely 4 feet deep. Her lungs were full of mud. Her hands were torn and bloody, as if she had tried to claw her way through something that would not let her pass. Her face was frozen in terror. The coroner called it an accident. But everyone who had heard Marie's words understood the truth, and slave catching in Louisiana suddenly became a profession no amount of money could justify. Word spread quickly through the hidden networks that connected slave catchers, plantation owners, and everyone whose livelihood depended on maintaining slavery's brutal machinery. Something was happening at Beaumont Estate, something that made pursuing runaways from that plantation uniquely dangerous. It was tied to a girl who looked barely adolescent, but spoke with unsettling authority, whose predictions of death proved disturbingly accurate. Some dismissed the stories as superstition, insisting that 2 disappearances meant nothing more than the bayous being dangerous, as they always had been. Others, especially those who had worked in Louisiana long enough to develop a healthy respect for voodoo and the spiritual forces white society pretended did not exist, began refusing any assignment that would take them anywhere near Beaumont land. Master Beaumont found himself trapped in a position he could not escape. He could not sell Marie. Her reputation had made her worthless, on the open market. No one wanted to purchase a child rumored to be curseborn and capable of killing through supernatural means. But he could not free her either, because doing so would acknowledge the very supernatural claims he had spent his life ridiculing as ignorant superstition. And he could not kill her, because even he was no longer certain what consequences such a death might unleash. So he kept her, treating her with a wary combination of contempt and fear, and discovered that his runaway problem had effectively disappeared. Not because fewer people were attempting escape, but because no professional slave catcher would accept a commission tied to his plantation. In the quarters, Marie became something between guardian and prophet. She offered protection to those planning escape and promised that anyone who came hunting them would never return. She continued her work in the big house, continued performing obedience, just convincingly enough to prevent Beaumont from having justification to punish her again. But everyone, enslaved and enslaver alike, knew that her submission was an act. She was waiting, watching, and accumulating power through means no one could fully control or comprehend. As Tante Josephine grew old and began to sense her own death approaching, she told Marie quietly one evening, "Your mama paid a terrible price to make you what you are. Don't waste that price. Use what you got to even accounts that been unbalanced since the first slave ship crossed the ocean." Marie intended to do exactly that. The third slave catcher to disappear was a man named Gaspar, an experienced tracker who should have known better. He had grown up in Louisiana and understood that voodoo was not mere superstition to be dismissed by educated white men. But greed conquered caution when Master Beaumont offered triple the usual fee to track down a family of 4 who had escaped during grinding season, when all available labor was focused on processing cane before it spoiled. Gaspar arrived with 2 associates, hard men who had built their lives on violence and intimidation. All 3 made the fatal mistake of treating Marie as nothing more than an enslaved child. They cornered her in the laundry house and demanded information about the escape route. When she claimed ignorance, one of the men grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, threatening worse if she did not cooperate. Marie looked at all 3 with those unnervingly deep eyes and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry more than one speaker at once. "3 of you came. None of you leave. The bayou has been hungry since the last rains. I promised it would be fed. You'll serve that purpose before the weekend." The men laughed nervously and released her, but their confidence was visibly shaken. Something in her tone, or in the air around her, triggered instincts their rational minds could not explain. They reported the encounter to Beaumont, who dismissed it with forced casualness that failed to hide his own discomfort. Then they went into the swamp. 2 days later, their boat was found drifting in a narrow bayou channel, perfectly intact and completely empty. Gaspar's body was discovered 3 miles away. He was an excellent swimmer, found in shallow, calm water that should have posed no danger. Yet his lungs were full of mud. His face was frozen in such absolute terror that the men who recovered him refused to describe what they had seen. They wrapped the body and buried it quickly, before questions could be asked. The other 2 men were never found. Fishermen later reported hearing screams one night that they first mistook for animals caught by an alligator, until they realized the sounds were disturbingly human and lasted far longer than any attack should have. The escaped family, meanwhile, reached free territory. Underground Railroad contacts later reported that they had arrived at a designated pickup point beneath a small cloth bag hanging from a tree branch, a gris-gris of extraordinary power. One conductor, familiar with Louisiana voodoo, recognized it as a protection charm that would have required either immense knowledge or immense spiritual backing. When asked where they obtained it, the family said simply that a girl from Beaumont Estate had given it to them the night before they fled. She told them exactly which route to take, and she promised that anyone who followed would feed the hungry water. By now, The pattern could no longer be denied. Slave catchers who accepted work connected to Beaumont either vanished entirely or returned broken by stories of things they could not explain. Word spread through every network tied to slavery's infrastructure, and Beaumont was becoming isolated. Other planters began avoiding him, fearing that whatever curse hung over his land might spread to theirs. His finances deteriorated rapidly. His inability to recover runaways and his failure to prevent new escapes became widely known. More enslaved people attempted to flee, encouraged by the knowledge that pursuit was now rare or non-existent. In the quarters, Marie's reputation evolved into something close to religious reverence mixed with deep fear. She was protector of those seeking freedom, but also something not entirely human, something shaped by her mother's desperate bargain, something that served purposes not always aligned with ordinary human desire. People sought her blessings for escape attempts. They begged for charms. They asked her to curse specific overseers and masters who had committed particular cruelties. She helped when she judged the cause worthy. She refused when she did not, and her judgment was final, because no one argued with a child who could kill professional trackers without ever lifting a hand. Tante Josephine continued teaching her, though the lessons had shifted from instruction to collaboration. Josephine carried centuries of traditional voodoo, songs, rituals, and relationships with the lower, shaped by African memory and Catholic masks. Marie carried something else entirely: direct access to forces that usually required negotiation, but that responded to her as if she were kin, or property, or a debt being collected. Together, they created workings more powerful than either could have achieved alone. One such ceremony, performed on St. John's Eve in 1854, became legendary in the quarters and terrifying to white people who heard whispers of it afterward. At midnight, they gathered along the shore of a narrow bayou feeding into the Mississippi. They drew elaborate vave in the mud, invoking Papa Legba, who opened gates between worlds, Maman Brigitte, who ruled the cemetery and protected the violently dead, and Baron Samedi, who walked between life and death and took particular interest in punishing slave catchers for filling the land with unmarked graves. They sacrificed a rooster. They poured rum and tobacco. They sang in Creole, French, and African languages older than any European presence in Louisiana. And when the ceremony reached its climax, when the spirits were meant to possess the living and speak through them, something unexpected happened. The possession ran backward, with Marie seemingly entering the spirits rather than being entered by them. Her consciousness expanded into unseen realms, while her body remained standing at the bayou's edge, speaking in a voice that echoed across the water and made everyone present feel both exalted and terrified at once. She spoke prophecy of slavery's eventual end, of the rivers of blood that would flow before freedom came, of the terrible price that would be extracted from everyone, enslaved and enslaver alike, before the accounts of history were finally balanced. And she promised that any slave catcher operating in Louisiana would face judgment not from human courts, but from older tribunals, ones that did not recognize legal ownership of human beings, and that had no statute of limitations for crimes committed against those the law refused to fully acknowledge as human. The effects of that ceremony rippled outward through both the physical and spiritual world. In the weeks that followed, several who had been present reported the same dream: slave catchers drowning in black water, while voices in African tongues pronounced sentence over their struggling bodies. 2 more professional trackers quietly abandoned Louisiana altogether, spreading stories of the cursed child at Beaumont, who spoke to things that lived in mud and mist. Even white people, who publicly mocked voodoo as ignorant superstition, began behaving differently. They avoided certain bayous after dark. They crossed themselves when passing the quarters where Marie lived, and sometimes, when they believed no one was watching, They left small offerings at crossroads or water's edges, instinctive insurance against forces they claimed not to believe in, but that some deep survival instinct recognized as real and dangerous. Master Beaumont grew increasingly desperate and increasingly powerless. He still could not sell Marie. No planter would risk buying a child rumored to be curseborn and capable of killing through supernatural means. He could not kill her outright, not only because he feared the consequences, but because his own enslaved workers made it quietly clear through slowdowns and subtle resistance that harming her would bring consequences he could neither predict nor prevent. He tried to separate her from Tante Josephine, hoping to cut off her access to voodoo knowledge, but he quickly learned that Marie's power did not depend on training. Josephine had only helped her understand and channel what already lived inside her, something intrinsic to whatever her mother had created when she bargained with forces beyond human control. He brought in a priest to cast out the demon he had finally admitted might truly exist. The priest took one look at Marie, crossed himself repeatedly, and refused to perform anything beyond a basic blessing. He muttered that some powers lay beyond the Church's jurisdiction, and that confronting forces older than Christianity usually led to catastrophe, not salvation. In desperation, Beaumont hired a man who claimed mastery of European ceremonial magic. The magician drew circles and pentagrams and chanted Latin invocations meant to bind hostile spirits. But Marie stepped through every protection as if they were stage decorations, looked at him with her two dark eyes, and said calmly, "Your powers are borrowed and conditional. Mine were paid for before I was born. Go home before you learn what happens when you challenge debts written in blood." The man fled at once, refused payment, and later sent Beaumont a letter, warning that the girl was a vessel for forces European traditions had no reliable way to control or banish, and that harming her would likely unleash something far worse than the disappearance of a few slave catchers. Beaumont added the letter to his growing collection of impossible evidence and resigned himself to containment rather than elimination. In the quarters, people began calling Marie other names. Some called her Timoun Loire, little child of the spirits. Others whispered Zanfan Malediction, the cursed child, and some simply called her Protector. Despite her fearsome reputation, she used her power primarily to help people escape and to punish those who created suffering beyond what bondage already demanded. All agreed she was something new, something born from Louisiana's strange fusion of African spirituality, Catholic imagery, swamp ecology, and generations of unburied suffering. When younger children asked her what she was and why she could do what others could not, she sometimes answered with a rare gentleness that hinted at the child she might have been. "My mama loved me so much she paid any price to make sure I could protect myself and protect others like us. Sometimes love makes miracles. Sometimes it makes monsters. Sometimes it makes both in the same person. And you got to live with that and use what you got right, even when you don't fully understand what you are or what's still being paid for your life." By the end of the summer of 1854, the legend of Marie the Curseborn Child had overtaken the real girl across the lower Mississippi. Runaways from distant plantations risked detours through cane fields just to seek her blessing, or retrieve a charm left in a hollow stump at the edge of the quarters before daring to flee. Slave catchers whispered her name in mockery and dread. Some swore the whole thing was a trick. Others claimed they had seen mist rise at her feet, or felt their blood turn cold when she looked their way. A few said they heard the cries of missing men echoing across the bayou at night. Master Beaumont, once proud of his ruthless control, descended into paranoia. He posted handbills offering ruinous bounties for a single returned runaway. But word among canal workers and free black communities was clear. Anyone foolish enough to hunt Beaumont's slaves risked never coming back. Labor slowed. Overseers grew uneasy. Even Beaumont's own children begged to avoid lessons after dusk, whispering fears of what walked the cane at night. Marie herself was changing. Her gifts grew stronger, but so did the price her mother had warned about. Her sleep thinned, crowded with dark dreams of endless water and rising faces. Sometimes she woke certain she had spoken with her mother's spirit, sometimes with others whose bones were lost, but whose stories burned in her chest. One night, Tante Josephine found her sleepwalking, standing waist-deep in the mud, speaking to shadows. She drew the girl back and whispered, "Even spirits need boundaries, child. Let them speak, but don't let them live in you too long. You still belong to this world." Not long after, 2 new runaways arrived at the quarters, bloodied from a failed escape elsewhere. They begged Marie for protection. That night she performed a ritual by the bayou, drawing vive with river mud and ash. Mixing spit and blood into a small gris-gris she pressed into their hands. The next day, Marie collapsed with fever and visions. She saw through unfamiliar eyes, slave catchers wading through reeds, dogs howling at shadows. She felt the surge as the bayou's spirits closed in around the men, driven by her will and the memory of her mother's bargain. She woke screaming. That week, 2 bodies washed ashore, lips blue, eyes wide. The 3rd hunter staggered out of the swamp half-mad, babbling about children's voices singing in Creole, clawing at walls before collapsing. The word swept through the parish. The Curseborn Child had done it again. Other planters, desperate to break the chain of losses, called in priests, conjure men, and even authorities from New Orleans. The priests sprinkled holy water and recited rites, but the air only grew heavier and the insects louder. One man tried to bind Marie, chanting Latin while drawing chalk circles and fitting brass rings. When she stepped forward, the chalk turned wet and slug-like. The man fled in terror and was never seen at Beaumont again. Josephine warned them, "Some powers in Louisiana don't scare for French prayers and crosses, yourself included." Yet the mounting powers demanded mounting prices. Children her age began to avoid Marie, afraid she could see the fate waiting for them. Adults, especially the elders, came only at night whispering, "Guard me, girl. Tell the spirits to favor me." Marie grew hollow-eyed and thin, shadowed by her own magic. Josephine, now frailer, begged her to rest, to retreat, to let the bayou sleep, or it'll drag you into its dreams. Marie tried, but the boundary between the living and the dead had grown too thin. She became a living myth. Some saw her as the only hope for deliverance. Others saw her as a warning, proof that some debts paid in blood could never be repaid, not even by the children born to bear them. Her greatest act came when a group of 5 field hands, led by a mother named Adeline, whose children had been sold months earlier, decided to flee. Marie met them beneath the Spanish moss and recited a blessing that was half invocation, half prophecy. No water will drown you but the water you choose. No dog will find your scent except one who loves you, and any man who follows you will wear the face of his own worst sin. She handed them a bundle, black river pebbles, a scrap of her mother's headscarf, all wrapped in filthy linen marked with reddish powder. They vanished into the swamp that same night. The men sent after them returned empty-handed. One fell sick and babbled in a fever about a ghostly girl leading him in circles. Another refused to enter the cane again, saying he would rather face the master's whip than test the cursed child's bargain. Adeline and the others reached New Orleans and the free Black Quarter, and within a month made it farther north, protected, it was said, not just by secrecy or luck, but by the death-dealing promise of a child who had made the Louisiana bayou her domain. Across the parishes, the legend spread. If you were born under a curse, you could either be its victim or turn it against those who truly deserved to disappear. The breaking point came in late autumn, when a consortium of planters, desperate to restore order and confidence in their control of human property, pooled their resources to hire what they believed was the ultimate solution, a man named Armand Thibodeau. He claimed descent from a long line of French occultists and advertised himself as a spiritual corrector, specializing in neutralizing African curses and restoring Christian order to corrupted land. He arrived at Beaumont Plantation with 2 assistants, a trunk full of ceremonial equipment, and absolute confidence that European magic was superior to anything African traditions could summon. Tall, imposing, dressed entirely in black, Thibodeau carried himself with theatrical authority, designed to impress the white clients who hired him and intimidate the black people he was sent to break. He toured the quarters, making loud proclamations about destroying the demon child's hold and restoring proper hierarchy, stopping often to draw chalk symbols or sprinkle holy water while muttering in Latin. The enslaved people watched with expressions ranging from skepticism to genuine fear, not of Thibodeau, but of what Marie might do in response. Marie herself showed no outward reaction. She continued her work in the big house, quiet and apparently submissive, giving no sign she considered the occultist any different from the many men who had tried to bind or banish her before. But those who knew her best, especially Tante Josephine, noticed the signs. Marie's eyes had darkened almost completely, the distinction between iris and pupil nearly gone. The air around her shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from her skin despite the cool of autumn. And at night, when she thought no one watched, she stood at the bayou's edge, holding long conversations in languages older than any European presence in Louisiana, speaking to things that answered back in voices like water sliding through reeds and wind-stirring mud. Thibodeau scheduled the exorcism for a Friday at sunset, for maximum dramatic effect. He established his ritual space in the clearing between the big house and the quarters, drawing an elaborate circle with chalk mixed with salt and herbs he claimed no African spirit could cross. Inside the circle, he placed braziers of incense, a table of religious texts and tools, and a chair where Marie would be bound during the ritual, meant to strip her of anything supernatural and reduce her to an ordinary enslaved child once more. Master Beaumont and several neighboring planters gathered to observe. The enslaved community was forced to attend as well, part public humiliation, part warning aimed at crushing resistance. As shadows stretched across the clearing, Thibodeau's assistants led Marie forward. Her wrists and ankles were bound with ropes supposedly blessed by bishops and washed in holy water from Rome. Thibodeau began his chanting, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadence, commanding any spirits within the child to depart. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Marie spoke, quietly at first, but with a voice layered with others, overlapping in many tongues at once. Your circles are pretty drawings with no power. Your Latin words are empty sounds. Your holy water is just water, blessed by men who never knew what blessing truly meant. You came here thinking European magic is stronger than African, because Europeans conquered African bodies. But spirits don't care about empires, skin color, or educated tongues. Spirits care about blood spilled, debts owed, and justice delayed. And Louisiana's soil is soaked with blood from people who looked like me. The ropes around her began to smoke. Thibodeau's chalk circle ran like wet ash across the ground, though no rain fell. The incense flared into thick black clouds. From the bayou came voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, singing in Creole and ancient African tongues, a song of celebration and mourning and threat all at once. Thibodeau's confidence shattered. He shouted louder, called on saints and angels, but fear broke through his theatrical control. Marie smiled. The ropes binding her disintegrated as if they had aged centuries in seconds. She stepped through the ruined circle, as if it were nothing more than stage paint, and walked toward the fallen occultist. "You can't defeat what you don't understand," she said, standing over him. while enslaved and enslaver alike watched in stunned silence. "You think magic is about pretty words and complicated rituals," Marie said, "about claiming authority from books written by men who never suffered. But real power comes from blood and bone, and from the kind of desperation that makes people bargain with forces they can't control, because slavery is worse than any spiritual price they might pay. My mother gave everything to make me what I am. Every slave catcher who vanished fed the debt she started paying. Every person who escaped because I protected them justified the cost. And you—" She leaned closer and whispered something only Thibodeau could hear. He screamed. It wasn't a sound of physical pain. It was the sound of a man who had just seen the full measure of his own mortality and what waited for him beyond it. He ran, dropped his equipment, abandoned his assistants, his reputation, everything he had built. He stumbled toward the road in blind terror, while the white observers stood frozen, caught between the urge to stop him and the fear of intervening in something far beyond their control. His assistants fled moments later, equally undone. Within minutes, the ritual ground was abandoned, except for Marie, standing calmly at its center, while smoke from the scattered braziers curled around her like a living thing. Master Beaumont, pale and trembling, finally stammered, "Get back to your quarters, all of you, now." The enslaved people didn't need to be told twice. They moved quickly, not quite running, casting glances at Marie filled with both gratitude and fear. She walked back toward her cabin as the white observers dispersed behind her, whispering urgently about what they had witnessed and what it meant for their ability to rule people they had convinced themselves were powerless. That night, Tante Josephine found Marie sitting at the bayou's edge, crying for the first time anyone could remember. These were not tears of fear or pain, but of grief, exhaustion, and understanding. "I'm so tired," Marie whispered. "Everything I do makes the debt bigger. Every person I help means another piece of who I might have been gets traded away. Mama paid for me with her life. I'm paying for others with whatever I would have been if I'd been born normal, and it's never enough. The bayou is always hungry. The spirits always want more. I don't know if there's enough of me left to keep feeding them and still be human when it's over." Josephine held her and rocked her like the child she should have been allowed to be. "Your mama knew what she was doing," she whispered. "She chose this because she loved you more than her own life. She wanted you to have power in a world built to keep you powerless. That don't make it fair, but it makes it holy in its own way. And it makes you holy too, even when you feel like a monster. Remember that. You're human and spirit both. Curse and blessing both, and that's heavy, but it's also exactly what this cursed place needs." In the weeks that followed, the story of Thibodeau's humiliation raced through Louisiana's shadow networks of planters, slave catchers, and profiteers of human bondage. Thibodeau himself fled the state, hiding in Texas and muttering about demons European magic could not touch. No other spiritual corrector would accept any commission tied to Beaumont plantation. The result was simple. Beaumont became a place runaways could flee, with little fear of professional pursuit. Marie continued her work, continued protecting escapes, continued accumulating debts whose final cost she did not yet understand, but accepted as the necessary price of resistance in a world where every legal path had been sealed by violence and law. She was 13 years old, and already legend, curse and blessing, monster and savior, a weapon created by love and forged by horror, and she accepted the role because refusing it would mean letting the weapon rust while innocent people died unprotected. Marie lived only 7 more years after Thibodeau. 7 years of growing legend and deepening isolation. The cost became visible. She grew thin despite food. Grey streaked her hair before 15. Her eyes carried shadows of worlds most people never touched. The enslaved community regarded her with awe and fear, knowing she was their shield, and that the shield demanded payment. Children were told stories of Marie as both warning and inspiration. Be careful what you bargain for, but also remember, sometimes desperation is the only door left open. Parents whispered her name like a prayer when their own children fled. The person named Marie slowly vanished beneath the symbol she became. Master Beaumont aged into ruin, his fortune withered. No buyer would touch cursed land. He considered freeing Marie to rid himself of her, but pride and terror stopped him. He was no longer certain what would happen if he tried. Tante Josephine died peacefully in 1858 after teaching Marie everything she knew. On her deathbed, she whispered, "You're not a monster. You're the answer to prayers people been praying since the first slave ship ever landed here. Your mama understood that. Don't waste her sacrifice by hating yourself. Use what you are, and trust that somewhere beyond all this suffering, justice still keeps its books." Marie carried those words through the final years before war tore the nation apart. She helped dozens more escape. Each carried a small gris-gris she had prepared. Each was protected by the accumulated power of all the escapes before them, and all the slave catchers who vanished trying to stop them. When the Civil War began in 1861, Marie was only 20 years old, and she looked 40. Her body showed the physical toll of years spent serving as a conduit for forces never meant to inhabit human flesh for long. The war brought chaos to Louisiana. Union troops moved up the Mississippi. The plantation system that had shaped every life for generations collapsed almost overnight. Beaumont Estate was occupied by federal forces. Master Beaumont fled to Texas and never returned. The enslaved people were suddenly free, at least on paper, but uncertain what freedom truly meant or how to survive in a world that had been violently reshaped. Marie remained at the plantation at first, not because she lacked options, but because people still came seeking her help. Now they asked for protection from bandits and guerrilla fighters who roamed the countryside in the war's chaos. They asked for healing of battlefield wounds. They asked for guidance on how to move from slavery into an unknown future. She still worked at the bayou's edge, still called on the lower realms, still drew power from the spirit world, but now she added prayers for peace and rebuilding instead of only vengeance and escape. The war had made her original purpose, protecting runaways and punishing slave catchers, largely obsolete. And for the first time, she struggled to understand what a curseborn child was meant to be in a world where slavery was ending, and the resistance she had been created for was becoming history. During this time, she began to see visions. She dreamed of her mother, Celestine, standing at the bayou's edge, calling for her to cross over. The visions carried a clear message. The debt that had created Marie was finally coming due, not in small accumulating costs, but in one final total payment. Marie understood. Her life had always been borrowed time, extended first by her mother's bargain, and then by her own service to the spirits and to resistance, and all debts are eventually collected. Spiritual accounts allow no bankruptcy, no forgiveness, only payment. One night in the spring of 1863, she walked into the bayou. She moved calmly into the water that had been her ally, her weapon, and her home. People watched from the quarters, because some instinct told them this night mattered. They saw the water rise to her waist, her chest, her shoulders. They saw her pause once and look back. On her face was exhaustion, relief, and something very close to peace. They saw her speak words they could not hear to things they could not see. And then she slipped beneath the surface as smoothly as if she had been born to water instead of land. They searched for days. They never found her body. The only trace of her was the small gris-gris bag she had worn around her neck. found hanging from a cypress branch at the bayou's edge, as if left there as a final message, a final protection for those who came after. The community buried the gris-gris with full ceremony, treating it as her body. They prayed over it in Creole, French, and African languages, thanking her for her life and begging the spirits to give her the rest she had never been granted on earth. The legend of Marie, the curse-born child of Louisiana, spread far beyond Beaumont in the years that followed. In quarters, churches, and gathering places, her story lived somewhere between history and myth, between human and spirit, between tragedy and triumph. Some stories focused on the sorrow. A girl turned into a weapon by a mother's desperate love, denied childhood, youth, and ordinary happiness. Others told of her power, the girl who made slave catchers fear her more than any armed resistance, who protected countless escapees, who proved the enslaved were never as powerless as their masters claimed. The truth, as always, was both. Marie had been victim and agent, cursed and blessed, monster and savior. She had been shaped by a bargain meant to serve a cause larger than personal happiness, and she accepted that role even though it consumed her, because refusing it would have meant letting the weapon rust while people who needed it suffered and died. Her life was sacrifice, but it was sacrifice in service to something greater than any single life, inside a system built to treat human beings as property instead of people. Years later, travelers in Louisiana would sometimes claim they saw a young girl standing at the bayou's edge at dusk or dawn, watching with eyes far too old for her face. Locals would only nod and say, "That's Marie, still watching." Whether those sightings were spirit or shadow no longer mattered. What mattered was the belief, and belief itself became a kind of protection. Courage born of belief often worked just as well as any magic. Her story joined Louisiana's deep folklore of voodoo, resistance, and rebellion, alongside Marie Laveau, Dr. John, and countless unnamed practitioners who used spiritual power to challenge systems built on violence and law. It stood as a reminder that desperation creates forms of resistance the powerful cannot control, because that resistance draws on forces they refuse to acknowledge. When a mother's love becomes desperate enough to bargain with the unknowable, when a child is born to be a weapon instead of a daughter, when mud and memory and suffering combine into something that makes the powerful afraid, that is when resistance becomes something no empire can hold. If the story of Marie moved you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest systems, people fight back, and that sometimes the price of fighting is paid in souls rather than coins, then remember her. Because Marie, because Celestine, because every person who ran toward freedom under protection older than any American law. Their courage lit paths we still walk, and their memory demands that we never stop fighting for justice, no matter what price must be paid.